2018 has been an important year for Sony's mobile division, which debuted the biggest change in hardware design we've seen in several generations from the company, and continues to make sweeping changes with the Xperia XZ3. From a camera standpoint, there's nothing different about the rear-facing camera when compared to recent Xperia XZ devices. That's the same 19-megapixel Motion Eye camera with a large 1x2.3-inch sensor, 1.22 micron pixel size, and an f-stop 2.0 Sony G lens with a wide 81-degree field of view. Most main rear-facing cameras are between 71 and 75 degrees on average, so this is a fair bit wider than other phones. The front-facing camera is getting the huge upgrade from the Xperia XZ2 Premium, which brings a 13-megapixel 1x3.02-inch sensor behind an 86-degree field of view f-stop 2.2 lens. That's a big upgrade from the 5-megapixel 1/5-inch sensor on the regular Xperia XZ2. Specs aside, there's also a big new camera redesign which brings a much-desired visual refresh to the camera while still retaining all the good stuff behind the scenes, and some unfortunate other limitations as well. A swipe left or right will swap between photo and video modes in a snap, with the rest of the modes located in a clearly labeled white Modes button at the bottom, which is within thumb's reach at all times. This is a fantastic design that makes modes easy to find, with some brand new colorful flat icons for each mode too, helping bring visual aids to the table for fast switching. The biggest problem comes in those tertiary modes like bokeh or AR effect, which launch an entirely separate app instead of keeping everything in the main camera app. This has been a problem for generations now, and it cuts down on the size of the camera app, but it ends up being more of a hassle because you have to unlock the phone or wait a bit for these other apps to launch. Back in that main interface, along the top, you'll find the usual row of quick setting toggles like flash or brightness adjust, as well as a tiny button for switching between front and rear cameras, but a quick swipe down will also do this as well. This many swipes could lead to erroneous switching of the cameras, but Sony requires you to drag down a bit before the cameras switch, much like refreshing a web page through Chrome, for instance, so you're probably not going to find yourself doing this on accident very often. Launch speeds and focus times are excellent with a hybrid autofocus that's rated at 0.03 seconds to focus, although the visual behavior of this has always been a bit weird. Press the shutter and you'll find the camera always refocuses the scene, giving the illusion that it takes a long time to actually take the picture, but this is done for a number of reasons. First off is the Predictive Capture ability, which detects things like smiles on faces or motion in a scene, and will later present you with up to 4 full resolution options to choose from instead of just the shutter timing. This bit is a one-up on Google's Top Shot implementation, as Top Shot allows you to choose from any point in time in the 2-second capture window, but the massive drop to 1 or 3 megapixel resolution renders those options somewhat useless in a number of cases. It's not just full resolution photos in Predictive Capture that makes Sony's implementation better. It's the fact that the camera refocuses between every single one of these shots, ensuring that your subject is always in focus and blur-free, something the camera specifically looks for when picking images out of the burst. Object tracking, done by simply clicking on anything in the viewfinder, will also help mark out this feature and will work to trigger the selection more often. My only complaint would be that I wish Sony would allow me to have a little more manual control when this background task kicks in, rather than hoping it noticed someone blink or move in the last second. Most phones take sufficient daytime photos, but it's fun to delve into the specifics of what sets each phone apart from the others. During well-lit conditions, you'll find the Xperia XZ3's colors are usually very accurate, with a slight bump to saturation at times, but this comes across as pleasant rather than offensive. Sony has been using the scene detection concept longer than any other OEM I can think of, and detecting the correct scene is paramount for getting the best shot, particularly when it comes to dynamic range. Landscape and backlight often seem to produce the widest dynamic range shots. Otherwise, the camera will prioritize exposure based on what appears to be spot metering-like behavior, rather than trying to balance the scene out as a whole. This means the foreground is usually prioritized for being bright enough to see at the expense of blown-out highlights in other parts of the photo. Crop detail is stellar, oftentimes besting most other phones, which should be expected given the 19-megapixel resolution, and the fact that this has been the case with Sony flagships for a while anyway. Saturation and contrast can look a bit elevated over what's truly natural, depending on what scene detection determines. But things like food or foliage will be nice and saturated without looking wholly unrealistic. For comparison, Samsung tends to oversaturate colors but usually has excellent dynamic range, while Google's colors are often more realistic, but we've seen dynamic range suffer this year as the camera tends to turn the contrast up a tad too high, crushing shadow detail in the process. In shots where Sony's scene detection correctly identified objects and changed the processing mode, the XZ3's photos tend to look the best as they often have better dynamic range than phones like the Pixel 3, sport more pleasant colors than Huawei's 2018 flagships, and keep from looking too unrealistic as Samsung's colors can sometimes be. In scenes where detection either got it wrong or chose something I wouldn't have, things tend to look overexposed and blown out. Regardless of exposure though, the Xperia XZ3 usually has a slight bit of enhanced detail when compared with the other phones. Sony's noise reduction seems to be less aggressive than previous generations, which only further enhances the extra detail in scenes, sometimes at the expense of adding a tad bit of noise and shadows. When zooming in with the viewfinder, you'll find the 19 megapixel resolution isn't quite enough to truly compete with phones that have a secondary camera with optical zoom, and in some cases the difference can be truly drastic. Optical zoom lenses have become particularly important in recent years, as manufacturers have been able to put higher quality sensors behind the secondary lens, sometimes even using hybrid imagery to enhance the pictures to further levels of detail. Compared to other phones with digital zooming only, however, you'll find that Sony does a great job of keeping detail high, even though this is really only a crop of the full-frame image. Speaking of advantages two sensors usually bring, Sony's portrait mode really needs a full overhaul though, as it's really just not good, especially when compared to other phones out there. Second camera or not, it needs some reworking. This also goes for the AR mode in the camera, which is probably more of a niche thing than anything, but just comes across as feeling really old. It's slow, doesn't have good placement or spatial recognition, and would be best if just replaced with something that runs on Google's AR core platform instead. The front-facing camera has the potential to be truly excellent, especially in low light, but it seems to be constantly plagued with focusing issues. Most front-facing cameras are fixed focus, but Sony is one of the few manufacturers who is utilizing an autofocus mechanism on the front-facing camera. For whatever reason though, it seems like this camera prioritizes the background more often than the foreground, which obviously is problematic for a front-facing camera. Photos don't look bad because of this, but it's really obvious that the desired subject isn't in focus at times, and this was consistent in almost every shot taken. The times where it focused on the right subject looked excellent, as color accuracy is great, contrast and exposure are fantastic, colors look rich and deep, and subjects were sharp and detailed thanks to the 13 megapixel resolution. Even in low light, we see the new larger sensor pull ahead of the competition both in terms of detail and color accuracy, and in many of these low light shots, the XZ3 is the only camera that got the colors in the scene correct, like these brown drapes that came across looking a bit green on the Mate 20 Pro and the Google Pixel 3. Even the front-facing flash looks great when needed, so hopefully Sony can resolve these focusing issues with an update. Low light on the rear camera can be just as solid at times, but the small 1.22 micron pixels and the relatively high f-stop 2.0 lens just don't do the phone a whole lot of favors in the darkest of conditions. Just like the front-facing camera, lower light shots are more color accurate on the Xperia XZ3 than most other phones out there. Detail is often excellent, as Sony seems to be less afraid of letting a bit of noise in to preserve fine detail in shots. This often results in more detailed lower light shots than almost any other phone we've tested, no matter the light. Dim lighting, overcast days, dusk and dawn shots, tough indoor lighting conditions, none of it really seemed to make a difference, and the XZ3 typically pulls out more detail than any other phone in any of these conditions. The biggest issue comes in the form of dynamic range and overall amount of light in a scene. In lower light shots with harsh backlighting or lots of glowing windows or signage, the XZ3 will often either blow out these parts to make the rest of the scene light enough, or adjust to keep them from being blown out, which unfortunately makes a scene too dark, especially when there's a lot of these types of light sources. The camera seems to do best when it can focus on one type of lighting condition, like scenes where a single or no direct light sources exist, rather than multiple ones where it tends to get a bit confused. Ever since moving to the Motion Eye sensor with last year's XZ Premium, Sony's video recording image quality has really been impressive from a number of levels that other OEMs just don't compete on. They were the first to have HDR video recording earlier this year with the XZ2, which continues into the XZ3, and remains the only phone with HDR recording in the auto mode, whereas LG is the only other manufacturer to have this ability, but it's only available in manual video mode on the V40. It's tough to say how much use people will get out of HDR video, really just because it's less prominent than even 4K displays are, but it's also limited to 24 frames per second output, reducing the smoothness of the video, but overall image quality improvements might be something people prefer over high frame rates. It's good that Sony offers different high-quality video recording options too, since there's no 60 frames per second recording at 4K resolution, only 1080p, meaning it bests other flagships in its ability to record in 4K with HDR, but is behind those in the high frame rate department since it can't do 4K 60. Where video recording doesn't fare as well as in the stabilization department for 4K recording specifically. 1080p recording is as smooth as butter with little to no jitters at all, but 4K is definitely shakier than the competition in many cases. On the bright side, you won't find the weird micro jitters that happen when hybrid stabilization has a hard time keeping the frame still, something you'll notice on the Mate 20 side here while walking. Color reproduction on the XZ3 is really superb with deep, punchy colors that look phenomenal and exposure that generally does an excellent job of balancing things out. Phones like the Pixel 3 have better dynamic range during video, but colors tend to get slightly washed out, although the Xperia's deep colors oftentimes find themselves seated alongside slightly crushed black levels in brighter conditions due to a slight underexposure. Zoom detail is surprisingly good given that there's no secondary optical camera, and while the Mate 20 Pro might not have been the best phone to use in this particular comparison because it was having some focusing issues at the time, you can see that this would make a big difference in sharpness had it actually gotten the focus right. The XZ3 is also quite smooth during zooming thanks to some hybrid stabilization that's done during the cropped frame, while the Mate 20 Pro doesn't appear to have much more optical stabilization, which lets a bit of hand jitter into the frame to say the least. Audio quality from the XZ3 is simply superb. Check out this 1-minute sample comparison between the Mate 20 Pro and the Xperia XZ3 to hear just how accurately Sony's mics record the scene compared to what Huawei is doing on that phone.
Oh, I see. Yep.
Sony's is just a more rich experience with better spatialization, wider audio reproduction, and less of a tinny feel to the audio. Lastly is super slow-mo video, which is something Sony has done better than anyone else for quite some time now, and continues this trend with the XZ3. There's nothing different here from the XZ2, which introduced a resolution bump to 1080p for that 960 frames per second super slow-mo video. This allows for a wider view of your surroundings while simultaneously packing in significantly more detail than the competition, which can only record at 720p resolution for 960 frames per second video. The biggest problem with Sony's implementation is that you have to initiate the super slow motion manually by pressing the button in super slow-mo mode, while manufacturers like Samsung and Huawei have an automatic mode that will initiate super slow-mo when motion is detected. All in all, Sony has crafted another excellent camera experience that features improved quality over the previous generation, despite using much of the same hardware, as well as a great new camera interface that's both fast and easy to use. It's certainly not perfect though. There are still limitations when it comes to low light scenes, some issues with focusing on the front-facing camera, And a lack of a good portrait mode and optical zoom might turn some people off to the experience, but the overall level of detail, excellent colors, and 4K HDR recording make this a uniquely excellent experience among 2018 flagships. We hope you enjoyed that review and will subscribe to us for regularly updated content. Check out our new look on AndroidHeadlines.com where you'll get 24/7 worldwide tech news coverage. Thanks for watching, and until next time.